Margaret Hayes used to wake up every morning with a smile on her face. That was before her world came crashing down like a house of cards in a windstorm. She used to be the doctor's wife, respected and loved by everyone in Cedar Valley. People would tip their hats when she walked down Main Street. Children would wave from their front porches. The local shopkeepers would save the best apples and freshest bread just for her. But that was then. This was now. Now she woke up every morning with dread sitting heavy in her stomach like a cold stone. The sun might be shining bright outside her bedroom window, but for Margaret, every day felt like walking through a thunderstorm. She would lie in bed for a few extra minutes, gathering courage for what waited outside her front door. Her husband, Dr. William Hayes, had been the only doctor for 50 miles around. He was the kind of man who would ride out in the middle of a blizzard to deliver a baby or treat a broken leg. Rich or poor, it didn't matter to him. If you were hurting, he would help you. Margaret had loved that about him. She had loved how his eyes would light up when he talked about saving lives. The fire happened on a Tuesday night in October. Margaret still remembered the smell of smoke and the sound of people screaming. The medical supply building had gone up in flames like it was made of matchsticks. All the medicine for the poor folks. All the supplies Dr. Hayes had bought with his own money. Everything was gone in less than an hour. William had run into that burning building trying to save what he could. Margaret had begged him not to go, had grabbed his arm and pleaded with him to stay safe. But he couldn't bear the thought of people suffering without medicine. He never came back out. The whole town had mourned at his funeral. People cried real tears and talked about what a good man he was. Margaret thought that would be the end of it. She thought people would remember her husband's kindness and maybe show her some of that same kindness. She was wrong. It started with whispers. Margaret would walk into the bakery and suddenly all conversation would stop. Women would look at her sideways and then put their heads together, whispering behind their hands. She told herself she was imagining things. Grief could make your mind play tricks on you. But then the whispers got louder and the looks got meaner. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the general store, was the first to say it out loud. Margaret had come in to buy flour and salt, the same things she bought every week. But this time, Mrs. Peterson crossed her arms and glared at her. Mighty convenient that fire happened right when the bills were due, she said in a voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. Margaret felt like she'd been slapped. What do you mean? I mean, maybe some people needed that insurance money more than they needed medicine for poor folks. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She tried to speak, tried to defend herself, but her voice came out as just a whisper. My husband died in that fire. Did he though? Mrs. Peterson's eyes were cold as winter morning. Or did he just disappear with the money and leave you here to play the grieving widow? Margaret left without buying anything. She walked home with tears streaming down her cheeks, not understanding how the world had turned so cruel so fast. But that was just the beginning. Soon everyone in town seemed to believe the lie. They said William had stolen money meant for medicine. They said Margaret had helped him plan it. They said the fire was no accident. Some even whispered that Margaret had said it herself. None of it was true. Not a single word. But truth didn't seem to matter anymore. Margaret's daily trips to town became a nightmare. She would step out of her small house and immediately feel eyes watching her. Children who used to smile and wave now threw pebbles at her feet. Their mothers would pull them away quickly, but not before whispering something in their ears that would make the children stare at her with fear. The worst part was the bakery. Margaret had to buy bread somewhere, and Mrs. Coleman's bakery was the only one in town. But Mrs. Coleman had decided that Margaret was guilty of something terrible. Every time Margaret came in, the price of bread seemed to go up. That'll be 50 cents, Mrs. Coleman would say for a loaf that used to cost 20 cents. But last week, it was 40 cents, Margaret would say quietly. Prices go up when demand is high and trust is low, Mrs. Coleman would reply with a cold smile. Margaret would pay it because she had no choice. She needed to eat, but she could feel her small savings disappearing like water through a broken bucket. The doctor's practice had been seized by men in fancy suits who said William owed money to suppliers. Margaret tried to explain that her husband had used his own money to help poor patients, but they just shook their heads and took everything anyway. The medical books, the instruments, even the comfortable chair where William used to sit and write prescriptions. Margaret was left with almost nothing. Just the small house that was falling apart, and whatever coins she had hidden in a coffee tin under the kitchen floorboards. She tried to make money by taking and washing and mending clothes. Margaret had always been good with a needle, and she thought maybe people would let her work for them even if they didn't like her. But even that became impossible. Mrs. Rodriguez brought her a basket of torn clothes and promised to pay her $2 when the work was done. Margaret spent 3 days carefully mending every hole and stain. When she brought the clothes back, perfectly repaired, Mrs. Rodriguez looked them over with a frown. "This work isn't very good," she said, even though they both knew it was excellent. "I'll give you 50 cents. Margaret needed the money too badly to argue. She took the 50 cents and walked home with her head down, knowing that word would spread about her poor work and make it even harder to find jobs. Every morning became a test of courage. Margaret would stand at her front door, hand on the doorknob, trying to find the strength to face another day of cold stares and cruel words. She would remind herself that she needed food, that the roof needed repairs, that giving up wasn't an option. The walk to Main Street felt like walking through enemy territory. She would keep her eyes down and try to move quickly, but there was no escaping the comments that followed her like shadows. "There goes the fire starter," someone would mutter. "Should be ashamed to show her face," another would add. "Poor Dr. Hayes, married to a woman like that." Margaret learned to hold her tears until she got home. She learned to keep walking even when kids threw things at her. She learned to ignore the way shopkeepers would suddenly run out of whatever she needed to buy. She learned to live with loneliness so deep it felt like drowning. But through her kitchen window, she sometimes noticed something strange. A man in a nice suit would be standing across the street, watching. He was tall with dark hair and serious eyes. She didn't know who he was, but something about the way he watched made her think he might be seeing something different than everyone else. She didn't know yet that this man was James Morrison, the richest rancher in 3 counties. She didn't know that he owned half the buildings on Main Street and employed most of the men in town. She didn't know that he had been a friend of her husband's and had seen the kind of man William really was. Most importantly, she didn't know that James Morrison was getting angrier every day as he watched the town destroy an innocent woman for crimes she never committed. She didn't know that he was already making plans to do something about it. All Margaret knew was that each day was harder than the last, and she was running out of strength to keep fighting a battle she never should have had to fight in the first place. Winter came early that year, arriving like an unwelcome guest who wouldn't leave. By November, snow was already piling up against Margaret's windows, and the wind howled through the cracks in her old house like a lonely wolf. She would wake up some mornings to find frost on the inside of her bedroom window, her breath making little clouds in the freezing air. The first time someone stole her firewood, Margaret thought it might have been an accident. Maybe the delivery man had gotten confused about which house was hers. She walked to town in the bitter cold to ask about it, her thin coat doing little to keep out the wind that cut through her like a knife. "I delivered it right to your front porch," the wood seller said, not even looking up from his ledger. "Not my problem if you can't keep track of your own property." Margaret knew he was lying. She had been home all day and would have heard the wagon, but arguing wouldn't bring her firewood back, and she didn't have money to buy more. That night, she burned old newspapers and a broken chair leg to keep from freezing. The second time it happened, she saw them do it. 3 teenage boys loaded her small pile of wood into a wheelbarrow and rolled it away while she watched from behind her curtain. She recognized them as the sons of families who used to respect her husband. When she went to their parents, they just shrugged. "Boys will be boys," Mrs. Patterson said, with a cold smile. "Maybe if you hadn't brought so much shame to this town, people would be more inclined to help you." Margaret stopped buying firewood after that. Instead, she would walk to the edge of town in the early morning, when most people were still asleep, and gather fallen branches from the woods. Her hands would turn red and raw from the cold, and sometimes she would come home with cuts from thorny bushes, but at least she had something to burn. The broken windows started in December. Margaret would wake up to find rocks on her floor and cold air rushing through holes in her glass. She couldn't afford to have them fixed, so she covered them with pieces of cardboard and old blankets. Her house began to look abandoned, which only made people treat her worse. "Look at that place," she heard Mrs. Wilson say to her friend as they walked past. "Falling apart just like the woman who lives in it. Probably deserves each other." Margaret had learned to live with the cold and the whispers and the loneliness. She had learned to make soup from potato peels and to darn her stockings until they were more thread than original fabric. What she wasn't prepared for was how much worse things would get. The church social happened every month in the basement of St. Mary's. It was supposed to be a community gathering where people could buy homemade food and catch up with neighbors. Margaret had avoided going for months, knowing she wasn't welcome. But by January, she was so hungry and so desperate that she decided to risk it. She had saved up $2 over several weeks, hiding the coins in different places so she wouldn't be tempted to spend them. $2 would buy her a decent meal, and maybe some leftover bread to take home. Her stomach had been growling for days, and the thin soup she had been living on wasn't enough anymore. Margaret waited until the social had been going for an hour before she slipped in through the side door. She hoped that if she was quiet and quick, she could buy something and leave without causing trouble. The basement was warm and filled with the smell of fried chicken and fresh bread. Her mouth watered just breathing it in. She made her way to the food table, keeping her head down and trying not to make eye contact with anyone. Most people ignored her, which was better than usual. She was starting to think she might actually get through this without incident. "What do you think you're doing here?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Jenkins, the banker's wife. She was a large woman with a voice that could carry across 3 counties, and she wasn't trying to keep it down now. Conversations around the room began to stop as people turned to look. "I just came to buy some food," Margaret said quietly, her hand tightening around the $2 in her pocket. "This is a church social for respectable people," Mrs. Jenkins said, her face turning red with anger. "We don't serve murderers and thieves." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm not a murderer or a thief. I'm just hungry. Your husband stole medicine from sick children." Mrs. Rodriguez joined in, stepping closer. "And you helped him do it." "That's not true," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "William never stole anything. He gave his own money to help people." More women were gathering around now, forming a circle that made Margaret feel trapped. Their faces were hard and angry, like they had been waiting for this moment for months. "Liar," Mrs. Coleman spat. "We all know what really happened in that fire." Margaret tried to step backwards, but there were too many people behind her now. The circle was getting tighter, and the voices were getting louder. She could feel panic rising in her chest like floodwater. "I think you should leave," Mrs. Patterson said, but she wasn't moving aside to let Margaret pass. "I'm trying to," Margaret said, looking desperately for a way out. That's when Mrs. Jenkins reached out and grabbed Margaret's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. "Maybe you need help remembering where you're not wanted." The slap came so fast that Margaret didn't see it coming. Mrs. Jenkins's hand connected with her cheek with a sound like a gunshot, and Margaret stumbled backwards into Mrs. Rodriguez. "Don't you dare touch me," Mrs. Rodriguez shrieked, shoving Margaret hard enough to send her falling to her knees. After that, everything happened at once. Hands were grabbing at her, voices were shouting accusations, and Margaret found herself on the cold basement floor with women standing over her like vultures. Someone pulled her hair. Someone else kicked at her legs. She tried to protect her face with her arms, but there were too many of them. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain, though that was bad enough. The worst part was seeing these women, who went to church every Sunday and sang hymns about love and forgiveness, transform into something cruel and vicious. These were mothers and grandmothers, people who should have known better. Margaret tried to crawl toward the door, but every time she moved, someone would push her back down. Her dress tore at the shoulder, and she could taste blood from her split lip. The $2 she had saved fell out of her pocket and scattered across the floor, but no one seemed to notice except her. "Please," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the angry shouting. Mrs. Jenkins raised her foot, aiming for Margaret's ribs, when a voice cut through the noise like a sword through silk. "That's enough." The two words carried so much authority that every person in that basement froze. Even Mrs. Jenkins, with her foot still raised, went perfectly still. Margaret looked up through her tangled hair to see a tall man in an expensive suit standing in the doorway. She recognized him as the man who had been watching from across the street, but she had never seen him up close before. He had dark hair with touches of gray at the temples and eyes that seemed to see everything. Right now, those eyes were looking at the women around Margaret with a coldness that made the basement feel even chillier than it already was. "Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Jenkins stammered, quickly lowering her foot. I saw exactly what you were doing," James Morrison said, his voice quiet but deadly serious. "And I think you should all be ashamed of yourselves." He walked through the crowd, and people stepped aside like he was royalty. When he reached Margaret, he knelt down beside her, his expensive suit touching the dirty floor without him seeming to care. "Ma'am," he said gently, offering her his hand. "Let me help you up." Margaret looked at his outstretched hand, hardly able to believe that someone was actually offering to help her. She had been alone for so long that kindness felt foreign, almost frightening. But something in his eyes made her trust him. She took his hand, and he helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness. Her legs were shaking, and she might have fallen again if he hadn't steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice still gentle but his eyes still hard as steel when he looked at the women around them. Margaret touched her split lip and nodded. "I'll be fine." James Morrison looked around the room at faces that had been twisted with anger just moments before but now showed fear and embarrassment. These people owed him money, worked for him, or rented buildings from him. In a small town like Cedar Valley, crossing James Morrison was like jumping off a cliff. "I think this social is over," he said. And it wasn't a suggestion. People began to leave quickly, grabbing their coats and avoiding eye contact. Soon, the basement was empty except for Margaret, James, and the scattered remains of her $2 on the floor. James helped her collect the coins, even though she protested that it wasn't necessary. When they were done, he offered her his arm. "Let me walk you home," he said. Margaret wanted to refuse. She had learned not to trust anyone, and accepting help from a stranger seemed dangerous. But she was tired and hurt and scared, and the kindness in his voice was like water to someone dying of thirst. As they walked through the snowy streets, James Morrison made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He had watched this woman suffer for months, had seen her dignity in the face of cruelty, and had finally witnessed just how far the town's hatred had gone. It was time to do something about it. Margaret woke up the next morning expecting to find the previous night had been just a dream. Surely no one as important as James Morrison had actually helped her. Surely she had imagined the kindness in his voice and the way he had stood up to those women like an avenging angel. But when she touched her split lip and felt the tender bruise on her cheek, she knew it had all been real. She was making weak coffee from grounds she had already used twice when she heard the sound of wagon wheels outside her house. Margaret peeked through her patched curtain and felt her heart skip a beat. A large wagon was stopped in front of her gate, loaded with supplies and pulled by two beautiful horses. James Morrison sat on the driver's seat, and two ranch hands were already climbing down from the back. Margaret's first instinct was to hide. She wasn't dressed for company, her hair was a mess, and her house was barely fit for visitors. But before she could retreat, James had spotted her at the window and tipped his hat in greeting. "Mrs. Hayes," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the small yard. "I hope you don't mind us stopping by so early." Margaret smoothed her hair as best she could and opened her front door, stepping out onto her small porch despite the cold morning air. "Mr. Morrison, you really didn't need to come all this way." "Actually, I think I did," he said, climbing down from the wagon with easy grace. "Tom, Billy, start with those windows." The two ranch hands began unloading glass panes and tools from the wagon. Margaret watched in amazement as they started removing the cardboard and blankets she had used to cover her broken windows. One of them, a young man with kind eyes, smiled at her. "Don't you worry, ma'am. We'll have these fixed up in no time. I can't pay for this," Margaret said quickly, panic rising in her voice. She had learned that everything came with a price, and she had nothing left to give. James Morrison stepped closer, removing his hat and holding it respectfully in his hands. "There's no charge, Mrs. Hayes. Consider it a neighborly gesture." Margaret stared at him, searching his face for some sign of what he really wanted. In her experience, men like James Morrison didn't do things out of pure kindness. They were businessmen first and foremost. There had to be a catch. "I don't understand," she said honestly. "Would you mind if I came inside? I'd like to talk to you about something, and it's a bit cold out here for a proper conversation." Margaret hesitated. Having a man in her house, especially one she barely knew, felt dangerous. But the ranch hands were working just outside, and something about James Morrison's manner put her at ease. He seemed respectful, not threatening. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. Her small living room looked even shabbier with such a well-dressed man standing in it. Margaret was acutely aware of the patched furniture, the thin rugs, and the general air of poverty that hung over everything like dust. But if James noticed these things, he didn't show it. "This is a nice house," he said, and he seemed to mean it. "Good bones. Your husband chose well." The mention of William brought tears to Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. "He loved this place. Said it felt like home the moment we walked through the door." James nodded, studying the small framed photograph of William that sat on the mantelpiece. "He was a good man. I had the privilege of knowing him professionally." "You knew William?" Margaret asked, surprised. "I did. He treated several of my ranch hands over the years. Never asked for payment when times were tough. Always said healing folks was more important than making money." James turned to look at her directly. "That's how I know the things people are saying about him aren't true." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of pain she hadn't even realized was there. For months, she had been surrounded by people who spoke of her husband like he was a criminal. Hearing someone defend his memory felt like rain after a long drought. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, needing something to do with her hands. "That would be nice, thank you." As Margaret busied herself with the coffee, she could hear the ranch hands working outside, the sound of hammering and the scrape of tools. It occurred to her that this was the first time in months that the sounds around her house were constructive rather than destructive. When she returned with 2 cups of coffee, James was examining the small collection of medical books that William had managed to keep at home. They were the only books that hadn't been taken by the creditors. "Your husband taught you about medicine?" he asked. "Some. I helped him when patients came to the house, and he explained things as we worked. Said a doctor's wife should know how to help people even when he wasn't around." Margaret handed him his coffee and sat down in the chair across from him. "Why do you ask?" James settled back in his seat, seeming to gather his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful, like a man who was used to making important decisions. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm going to say something that might sound strange, but I hope you'll hear me out completely before you give me an answer." Margaret felt her heart start to beat faster. "All right. I own the Morrison Ranch, about 10 miles outside of town. It's a successful operation, but it's missing something important. It needs a woman's touch, someone who can manage the household and help care for the men when they get injured. Ranch work is dangerous, and we're always dealing with cuts, bruises, broken bones, and such." Margaret sipped her coffee and waited for him to continue, not sure where this conversation was heading. "I'm a bachelor, Mrs. Hayes. Never found the right woman to marry, and at my age, I'm starting to think I never will. But I need a partner, someone who can help make my ranch into a proper home." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I'm asking if you would consider marrying me." Margaret's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down with shaking hands. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I know it sounds sudden, but I've been thinking about this for weeks. You're in a difficult situation here, and I'm in need of a capable woman to help run my household. It seems like we might be able to help each other." Margaret stared at him, sure she must have misheard. "Mr. Morrison, you're one of the wealthiest men in the county. You could marry anyone you wanted. Why would you want to marry me?" "Because I've watched you these past months, and I've seen your character. You've faced terrible treatment with dignity. You've never struck back or lowered yourself to their level. That tells me you're a woman of strong moral fiber." He leaned forward slightly. "And because I knew your husband, and I believe any woman William Hayes chose to marry must be worth knowing." Margaret felt dizzy. Marriage to a stranger. It was impossible, crazy, completely out of the question, wasn't it? What exactly would you expect from such an arrangement? She asked carefully. James seemed to understand that she needed practical details, not romantic gestures. "You would manage my household, which currently consists of myself, my foreman, and 6 ranch hands. You would oversee the cooking, cleaning, and general organization of the house. When the men get injured, which happens regularly, you would provide basic medical care using the skills your husband taught you, and in return, you would have the protection of my name, a comfortable home, good food, and a generous monthly allowance for your personal needs. You would be treated with respect by everyone who works for me, and anyone in town who bothered you would find themselves dealing with me directly." Margaret's mind was spinning. It sounded too good to be true, which in her experience meant it probably was. What about other expectations? Married couples usually. James held up a hand, understanding her concern immediately. "This would be a marriage of convenience, Mrs. Hayes. A business arrangement between 2 people who need each other's help. Nothing more intimate would be expected unless you someday chose it to be. You would have your own bedroom, your own space, and complete control over how much or how little we interacted as husband and wife." The hammering outside had stopped, and one of the ranch hands called out, "All done with the windows, boss? Want us to start on that firewood?" "Yes, stack it nice and neat by the back door," James called back, then turned to Margaret again. "I don't expect an answer right now. This is a big decision, and you should take time to think about it." Margaret looked around her small, cold house, then thought about the broken windows that were now fixed, the firewood that was being stacked outside, and the kindness of this man who barely knew her, but was willing to help anyway. "If I said yes," she said slowly, "when would this happen?" "As soon as you were ready. Tomorrow, next week, whenever you felt comfortable." Margaret thought about facing another day of hatred in town, another night of counting coins to see if she could afford bread, another week of loneliness so deep it felt like drowning. Then she thought about having a purpose again, about using the medical skills William had taught her, about sleeping safely behind strong walls with a man who promised to protect her. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months, "I think I'd like to accept your proposal." James smiled for the first time since she'd met him, and his whole face transformed. "In that case, Mrs. Hayes, I think we should start planning a wedding." Outside, the ranch hands finished stacking the firewood and began loading their tools back into the wagon. Margaret watched them through her newly repaired windows and felt something she hadn't felt in months. 3 days later, Margaret stood in the parlor of the Morrison Ranch wearing a simple blue dress that James had bought for her in town. It was the first new piece of clothing she had owned in over a year, and the soft fabric felt like luxury against her skin. The dress was modest but well made, with tiny pearl buttons down the front and sleeves that fit her perfectly. The circuit preacher, Reverend Thompson, had arrived that morning with his worn Bible and kind smile. He was an older man who traveled from ranch to ranch, bringing wedding ceremonies and Sunday services to folks who lived too far from town to attend regular church. Margaret liked him immediately because he didn't ask uncomfortable questions or look at her with suspicion. "Marriage is a sacred bond," he said in his gentle voice, "built on mutual respect, trust, and the promise to stand by each other through good times and bad." Margaret glanced at James, who stood beside her looking handsome in his best suit. He had been nothing but kind and respectful since she had accepted his proposal. When she had worried about having nothing to bring to the marriage, he had assured her that her presence was enough. When she had fretted about not knowing how to run such a large household, he had promised that Rosa, his longtime housekeeper, would help her learn everything she needed to know. Rosa Martinez stood as one of their witnesses, beaming with joy as if this were her own daughter getting married. She was a plump, motherly woman in her 60s who had been working for James for nearly 20 years. When James had told her about the wedding, Rosa had clapped her hands together and declared it the best news she had heard in ages. The other witness was Tom Bradley, James's foreman. He was a weathered man with gentle eyes who had tipped his hat to Margaret when they were introduced and said, "Welcome to the ranch, ma'am. We're mighty glad to have you." The ceremony itself was simple and quick. Margaret repeated the vows in a voice that grew stronger with each word, and James spoke his promises with quiet sincerity. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, James squeezed her hand gently and smiled at her with warmth that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. After the preacher left with a good meal in his belly in payment for his services, Rosa took Margaret by the arm and began showing her around her new home. The Morrison Ranch house was bigger than any place Margaret had ever lived, with wide hallways, high ceilings, and windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. Mr. James built this house hoping to fill it with a family someday, Rosa explained as they walked through the spacious kitchen. It's been too quiet for too long. A house this size needs a woman's touch to make it feel like a real home. The kitchen was Rosa's domain, and it was clear she took great pride in it. There was a large wood-burning stove, shelves lined with dishes and cooking supplies, and a long wooden table where the ranch hands took their meals. Everything was clean and organized, but Margaret could see places where improvements could be made. "I hope you don't mind me making some suggestions," Margaret said carefully. She didn't want to step on Rosa's toes or make the older woman feel like she was being replaced. Rosa laughed, a warm sound that filled the kitchen. "Mija, I've been waiting years for someone to help me with this place. These men eat like horses and make messes like children. I could use all the help I can get." Margaret's bedroom was on the second floor, down the hall from James's room. It was larger than her entire house in town had been, with a comfortable bed, a writing desk by the window, and a wardrobe that could hold more clothes than she had ever owned. James had made it clear that this was her private space, and she could decorate it however she liked. "If you need anything changed or added, just let me know," he said, standing respectfully in the doorway rather than entering her room. "I want you to be comfortable here." That first week was an adjustment for everyone. Margaret threw herself into learning the routines of ranch life with the same determination that had helped her survive the town's cruelty. She woke up before dawn to help Rosa prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, who worked long hours and needed hearty meals to sustain them. The men were polite but cautious around her at first. They had heard stories about the trouble in town, and they weren't sure what to make of their boss's new wife. But Margaret won them over quickly with her gentle manner and willingness to help when they got hurt. The first test came when Billy Crawford, the youngest ranch hand, was thrown from his horse while trying to break a particularly stubborn bronco. He landed hard and came up clutching his arm, his face white with pain. The other men gathered around him, unsure what to do. "Bring him to the kitchen," Margaret said without hesitation, her medical training taking over. "Rosa, I need clean towels and hot water. Someone ride for the doctor, but don't wait for him to get here." Margaret examined Billy's arm with gentle but expert hands, feeling along the bones the way William had taught her. The young man winced but didn't complain, even when she had to manipulate his arm to determine the extent of the injury. "It's broken, but it's a clean break," she announced. "I can set it, but it's going to hurt." Billy looked up at her with eyes that reminded her of her younger brother. "Will I be able to use it again, ma'am, if we set it properly and you let it heal without rushing back to work? It should be as good as new," Margaret assured him. She worked quickly and efficiently, setting the bone and creating a splint from wooden slats and strips of cloth. Billy gritted his teeth but never cried out, even when the pain must have been intense. When she was finished, she made him a cup of willow bark tea to help with the pain. "You did that like a real doctor," Tom Bradley said, admiration clear in his voice. "My husband taught me well," Margaret replied simply. When the doctor finally Arrived 3 hours later, he examined Margaret's work and nodded approvingly. "Couldn't have done better myself," he said. "Where did you learn to set bones like that?" "Dr. Hayes was my teacher," Margaret said, and for once, speaking her husband's name didn't bring pain. Word of Margaret's medical skills spread quickly among the ranch hands. Within a few weeks, they were coming to her for everything from cuts and bruises to stomach ailments and headaches. She treated each man with the same gentle care, never making them feel foolish for their injuries or complaints. James watched all of this with growing admiration for his new wife. He had married her partly out of a sense of duty, and partly because he needed help managing his household. But he was beginning to see that Margaret brought something more valuable than efficiency to his ranch. She brought compassion. The evenings became Margaret's favorite time of day. After the ranch hands had eaten dinner and gone to their bunkhouse, she and James would sit in the parlor and talk. These conversations started out formal and careful, but gradually became more natural and comfortable. James told her about his plans for expanding the ranch, his concerns about cattle prices, and his hopes for the future. Margaret shared stories about her life with William, her love of reading, and her dreams of maybe having a garden where she could grow herbs for medicine. "There's a perfect spot behind the kitchen," James said one evening. "Gets morning sun, but afternoon shade. Rosa's been wanting someone to plant herbs there for years." "Really? You wouldn't mind, Margaret? This is your home now. You can plant anything you want, anywhere you want." The way he said her name, with such warmth and respect, made something flutter in her chest. She was beginning to understand that James Morrison was not just a good man, but a kind one. He never made her feel like a burden or an obligation. Instead, he seemed genuinely pleased to have her there. 1 month after their wedding, Margaret realized that she hadn't thought about the people in town for an entire day. She had been too busy helping Rosa plan meals, tending to a ranch hand's infected cut, and discussing plans for her herb garden with James. For the first time since William's death, she felt useful and wanted. That night, as she sat by her bedroom window looking out at the vast ranch lands under a sky full of stars, Margaret allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten: contentment. She was safe here, valued here, needed here. The constant knot of fear and sadness that had lived in her stomach for months was finally beginning to loosen. She didn't know yet that James lay awake in his own room most nights, thinking about her gentle laugh and the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her herb garden. She didn't know that he had begun to look forward to their evening conversations more than anything else in his day. What she did know was that accepting his proposal had been the right choice. For the first time in a long time, Margaret Hayes Morrison felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 6 months had passed since Margaret became Mrs. Morrison, and life at the ranch had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Her herb garden was thriving behind the kitchen, filled with chamomile, lavender, and willow bark that she used to treat the ranch hands' various ailments. The men no longer treated her like a stranger, but as part of the family, often bringing her wildflowers they found while working or asking her advice about letters they wanted to write to sweethearts back home. Margaret had grown comfortable in her role as the ranch's lady, managing the household with Rosa's cheerful help, and providing medical care that saved James from expensive trips to fetch the doctor. She had even started teaching some of the younger ranch hands to read and write during the long winter evenings, using books from James's surprisingly extensive library. But on a crisp spring morning, that peaceful life was threatened when a fancy carriage rolled up the long dirt road to the ranch house. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line when she saw it approaching, and something about the way the horses moved with practiced precision made her stomach clench with worry. 3 women stepped out of the carriage, their expensive dresses and elaborate hats marking them clearly as ladies from town. Margaret recognized them immediately: Mrs. Jenkins, Mrs. Coleman, and Mrs. Patterson, the same women who had attacked her at the church social. Her hands began to shake as she remembered the feel of their hands grabbing at her, their voices shouting accusations. Rosa appeared at her elbow, having seen the carriage from the kitchen window. "Who are those women, Mija? They look like trouble." "They are Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're from town." James emerged. from the barn where he had been checking on a sick horse, his face growing serious when he saw the visitors. He walked toward the carriage with the confident stride of a man who owned everything as far as the eye could see, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. "Ladies," he said politely, tipping his hat, "what brings you all the way out to my ranch?" Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward, smoothing her skirts and putting on her most charming smile. Margaret had seen that smile before, right before the woman had slapped her. "Mr. Morrison, we've come as concerned friends and neighbors. We're worried about you." "Worried about me?" James raised an eyebrow. "I can't imagine why." "Well, it's about your marriage," Mrs. Coleman joined in, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We know you're a good Christian man, and we hate to think that you might have been taken advantage of." Margaret felt the color drain from her face. She wanted to run into the house and hide, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. These women had come here to destroy the new life she had built, just like they had destroyed her old one. Mrs. Patterson stepped closer to James, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a confidence. "That woman has a reputation, Mr. Morrison. Surely you've heard the stories about what really happened to her husband. The fire wasn't an accident, and she wasn't the innocent victim she pretended to be." James's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I've heard the stories. I've also heard enough lies to know the difference between truth and gossip. But surely you can see that marrying her so quickly was a mistake," Mrs. Jenkins pressed on. "A man of your standing deserves better than damaged goods. There are plenty of respectable young women in town who would make you a proper wife." Margaret felt something break inside her chest. The words hit her like physical blows, each one confirming her worst fears about herself. Maybe they were right. Maybe James would eventually see her as the burden everyone said she was. Maybe this wonderful new life was too good to last. She turned and walked quickly toward the house, not wanting to hear any more. Rosa followed her, muttering angry words in Spanish that Margaret didn't understand but appreciated anyway. Inside the kitchen, Margaret sank into a chair and buried her face in her hands. The old feelings came rushing back: the shame, the fear, the certainty that she was cursed to bring trouble to everyone who tried to help her. "I should leave," she whispered to Rosa. "I should pack my things and go before I ruin everything for him." "Don't you dare," Rosa said fiercely, her hands on her hips. "Don't you let those Bruges drive you away from the best thing that ever happened to this ranch." But Margaret was already spiraling into the dark thoughts that had plagued her during her worst days in town. Maybe the women were right. Maybe James had married her out of pity and was already regretting it. Maybe she was just fooling herself thinking she could be happy. Outside, James was losing his patience with his unwelcome visitors. He had listened to enough of their poison to understand exactly why they had come. Several of their husbands owed him money, and they thought they could manipulate him by attacking his wife. "Ladies," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level that made all three women step back, "I think you should leave now. Mr. Morrison, please." Mrs. Jenkins tried one more time. "We're only thinking of your reputation. Surely you can see that this marriage is a mistake that needs to be corrected." "The only mistake I see," James said coldly, "is three women who have confused gossip with truth and cruelty with righteousness. My wife is a good woman who has shown more grace and dignity than any of you have ever possessed." He looked at each of them in turn, his eyes hard as winter ice. "Let me make something very clear. Anyone who insults my wife insults me. Anyone who threatens or harasses her will find themselves dealing with me directly. And I am not nearly as forgiving as she is." The women climbed back into their carriage quickly, their faces red with embarrassment and anger. As they drove away, James could hear Mrs. Jenkins complaining loudly about his ingratitude and poor judgment. He didn't care. He had more important things to worry about. He found Margaret in the kitchen, still sitting with her face in her hands, while Rosa hovered nearby like a protective mother hen. The sight of his wife looking so defeated made anger burn in his chest like a brand. "Margaret," he said softly, pulling out the chair beside her. "Look at me." She raised her head slowly, and he could see tears tracking down her cheeks. The sight made his heart ache in ways he hadn't expected when he first proposed their business arrangement. "I heard what they said," she whispered. Maybe they're right. Maybe you made a mistake marrying me. Maybe I should go before I cause you any more trouble. James felt something shift inside him, like a door opening in a room he hadn't known existed. Somewhere in the past 6 months, without him even realizing it, this marriage of convenience had become something much more important. Margaret, he said, reaching out to take her hands in his. You are not going anywhere. You are my wife, and this is your home. But they said lies. James interrupted firmly. The same lies they've been telling for months, and I'm tired of listening to them. He squeezed her hands gently. Do you know what I see when I look at you? Margaret shook her head, not trusting her voice. I see a woman who faced the worst kind of cruelty with dignity. I see someone who turned my house into a home, who cares for my men like they were her own family, who makes me look forward to coming inside at the end of each day. His voice grew softer. I see the woman I fell in love with, even though I never meant to. Margaret's eyes widened in shock. You? What? I love you, Margaret, James said simply. I didn't plan it, and I didn't expect it, but somewhere between watching you set Billy's arm and listening to you laugh at Rose's stories, I fell completely in love with my own wife. Margaret stared at him, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. But this was supposed to be a business arrangement. You said. I said a lot of things when I was trying to convince myself that I was being practical instead of following my heart. James smiled, the expression transforming his whole face. But I can't pretend anymore. I love you, and I want this to be a real marriage if you're willing. Margaret felt tears starting again, but these were different tears. These were tears of joy and relief, and wonder that such happiness was possible after so much pain. I love you too, she whispered, and saying the words felt like stepping out of a long, dark tunnel into bright sunlight. I didn't think I was allowed to love you, but I do. James stood up and pulled her into his arms, holding her close while Rosa wiped her own tears and muttered happily in Spanish. Outside, the ranch continued its daily business, but inside the kitchen, two people who had found each other in the most unexpected way were finally admitting what their hearts had known for months. That evening, as they sat together on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Margaret placed her hand over her stomach and shared the news that would make their happiness complete. James, she said softly, I'm going to have a baby. The smile that spread across his face was brighter than the setting sun. He kissed her gently and whispered, our baby will grow up knowing they're wanted and loved, just like their mother finally knows. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret realized that her story had come full circle. She had lost everything, her husband, her home, her place in the world, but in losing it all, she had found something even better. She had found a love that was built on respect and partnership, a family that chose her every day, and a future that stretched out before them like the endless Montana sky. The town might never ap